expectations. Chapter 1. Girls! Girls! Wake up, for goodness sake! Such news! Such glorious, delightful news! Mrs. Bennet burst into the breakfast parlor of Longbourn with the force of a small gale, her face flushed with excitement, her cap slightly askew. Her 5 daughters, still lingering over their tea and toast, looked up, some with weary resignation, others with nascent curiosity. "Mama, please," Jane, ever the gentle peacemaker, smiled softly. "What is it?" "The Meryton ball, my dears, this very evening. And guess who will be there?" She paused dramatically, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of triumph and anticipation. "The gentleman, the very rich gentleman who has let Netherfield Park, Mr. Bingley, with his relatives and friends, will all be attending." A flurry of delighted squeals erupted from Kitty and Lydia, who immediately began to discuss their gowns and potential dance partners. Mary, ever immersed in her book, merely shifted in her seat without comment. Mrs. Bennet beamed, her gaze sweeping over her eldest daughters. "Think of it, Jane! Mr. Bingley, a bachelor, with 4,000 or 5,000 a year, and his friends no doubt equally prosperous. What an opportunity! You must all be prepared. Your best ribbons, your prettiest smiles." Jane's beautiful features lit up with a sweet, hopeful glow. "Oh, Mama, how wonderful! I do hope they will be amiable gentlemen. It would be delightful to meet new acquaintances, especially those of such good fortune. Perhaps they will prove to be very kind and agreeable." The thought of amiable rich men, capable of bringing happiness and security, seemed to fill her with genuine pleasure. Elizabeth, however, watched her mother and sister with a familiar, discerning glint in her intelligent eyes. She buttered her toast slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible frown touching her brow. "Amiable Jane," she mused, her tone laced with a touch of dry skepticism, "or merely accustomed to having their slightest whim indulged, with no one daring to gainsay them?" Her mother, too absorbed in her matrimonial visions, barely registered Elizabeth's remark, but Jane, ever attentive, turned to her. "Oh, Lizzie, why should you think unkindly of them before we have even met?" Elizabeth sighed, a slight shrug accompanying her words. "For no other reason, my dearest Jane, than that humanity, in general, is prone to vanity and excessive self-regard, and those blessed with wealth and status are, I dare say, particularly susceptible. Why should they trouble themselves with civility, much less genuine amiability, when their position is secure?" She paused, her gaze distant, reflecting on the world as she saw it. "They are used to having their own way, you see, and when one has always had one's own way, the line between firm assertion and outright arrogance often blurs. I rather suspect they will be proud, even haughty, and perhaps, given a slight affront, even insulting." Her voice dropped to a quieter, more cynical tone. "And who, pray tell, would ever blame them? No one certainly of our acquaintance. For who would dare speak ill of a rich man?" Mrs. Bennet, finally catching the drift of Lizzie's less than enthusiastic outlook, threw up her hands. "Nonsense, Lizzie! Such foolishness! You will talk yourself out of a good match before you've even had a chance. A rich gentleman is a rich gentleman, and they are all, without exception, delightful when they are considering a wife." Elizabeth merely offered a small, knowing smile in response. She knew better than to argue with her mother on such matters. The assembly rooms of Netherfield buzzed with a gilded energy, the candlelight shimmering off polished floors and silken gowns. Laughter, music, and the low murmur of conversation wove a complex tapestry of sound, a perfect setting for the highly anticipated evening ball. Amidst this vibrant hum, the Bennet sisters, Jane and Elizabeth, moved with their customary grace, their hearts filled with very different, yet equally confirmed, expectations. For Jane, the evening was a gentle confirmation of her quiet hopes. Mr. Bingley, the master of Netherfield, was everything she had heard and more. His smile was as open as his generosity, his laughter genuine, his attention unfalteringly kind. He had sought her out for 2 dances, his compliments sincere, his conversation light and engaging. Jane's gentle heart bloomed under his regard, a soft, contented warmth settling within her. It seemed indeed as if he were precisely the man she might have dreamed of. His amiability was not merely a rumor. It was a tangible, delightful presence that had brightened every moment of her evening. But for Elizabeth, the ball was a different confirmation altogether. Her expectations, far from being of amiable gentlemen and pleasantries, had unfortunately been centered on Mr. Bingley's rich, imposing friend, Mr. Darcy. He was undeniably striking in his dark handsomeness and aristocratic bearing, but his haughty demeanor overshadowed any potential admiration. He stood aloof, observing everyone with a critical, almost disdainful air, dancing only with the ladies of his own party, and refusing to be introduced to any other. Elizabeth had, quite by accident, overheard a conversation between Mr. Bingley and his friend. Mr. Bingley, ever the cheerful host, had endeavored to persuade Mr. Darcy to join the dance. "Come, Darcy," he had urged, a benevolent smile on his face. "You must dance. I hate to see you standing about in this stupid manner. You will be as merry as myself by and by." And then had come the cutting words, delivered with a disdainful glance in Elizabeth's direction, as if she were merely a piece of furniture to be assessed and dismissed. "She is tolerable, I suppose, but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." The blood had rushed to Elizabeth's cheeks, a hot flush of indignation. To be so openly scorned, to have her appearance dissected and found wanting by a proud, supercilious man. Her initial momentary sting had swiftly hardened into a resolute disdain of her own. He might be rich, he might be handsome in a severe way, but he was insufferably arrogant. Her expectations of his pride and disagreeable nature had been not merely met, but resoundingly exceeded. Later, as the carriages were being called and the sisters huddled together, pulling their cloaks tight against the cool night air, their contrasting evenings became brilliantly clear. "Oh, Lizzie," Jane sighed, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Mr. Bingley is indeed quite the most agreeable man." "Is he not charming?" Elizabeth snorted delicately. "He is certainly amiable, dear Jane, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, is quite the most disagreeable, proud, insufferable man I have ever had the misfortune to encounter. I wouldn't dance with him if he were the last man in England." Two sisters, two utterly opposed impressions of the evening's key figures, and in those starkly diverging opinions lay the seeds of much future misunderstanding, and perhaps something more. Chapter 2. The crisis of Jane's sudden illness at Netherfield Park had provided an unexpected theater for observation, and the weeks that followed served only to confirm Elizabeth's most carefully laid expectations, both for her sister's felicity and for her own vexation. It was impossible to deny the devoted attention of Mr. Bingley. His anxiety, though perhaps bordering on the melodramatic in the first 2 days, soon settled into a steady, tender solicitude that warmed even Elizabeth's cynical heart. He hovered near Jane's sofa, regulated the draughts, insisted on the prompt administering of the prescribed remedies, and consulted the apothecary with the gravity of a man whose own life depended upon the patient's progress. To witness Jane receiving such unambiguous, respectful adoration was to confirm everything Elizabeth hoped, that her sister's merits were plainly visible to the one man who deserved them. The Bingley sisters, too, performed their duties admirably, though with a distinct difference in motivation. They offered their attendance with a high degree of polish, ordering the servants to attend to Jane's every need. Yet Elizabeth discerned in their forced sympathy a calculation, an awareness that to neglect the sick guest of their beloved brother would be detrimental to their own social standing. They were kind because they were rich, and they administered comfort to Jane because it was the easiest way to retain their influence over Mr. Bingley. But if Jane's treatment was generally gratifying, Elizabeth's own reception was a daily confirmation of her less optimistic forecasts. The distance between herself and the Netherfield ladies was established early, maintained with ritualistic precision, and deepened by intellectual disagreement. Caroline Bingley found Elizabeth's presence a trial and an infringement upon her private pursuit of Mr. Darcy, and she employed every subtle weapon in the arsenal of fashionable disdain. She treated Elizabeth's opinions with polite surprise, her attire with a silent, critical assessment, and her family with delicate, yet pointed omission. Mrs. Hurst, similarly, treated Elizabeth as a necessary evil, a vulgar appendage to the beautiful, well-disposed Jane. She could manage a condescending smile, but her favorite strategy was the complete disregard of Elizabeth's existence in company, reserving her interest only for the superficialities of card games or the arrangement of ribbons. Elizabeth bore this treatment with an outward composure that belied the active churning of her mind. She had expected their envy and their vanity. She had not expected, perhaps, quite such profound boredom. Her principal engagement, however, remained Mr. Darcy. The weeks of confinement together, which might have led to familiarity, only served to cement their mutual opposition. They fenced nightly over books and manners, each finding the other's pride and prejudice inexcusable. Elizabeth found his silence arrogant. He found her liveliness bordering on the improper. The confirmation of all her worst fears regarding his character, and, wounding her infinitely more, regarding her own family's societal standing, came late one bitter afternoon in the library. Elizabeth, having escaped the relentless trivialities of the drawing room, had seated herself in a deep window recess, intending to read, but was drawn more to the sound of rain lashing against the glass. The library door, which connected to a small, seldom used withdrawing room, was ajar, and she soon heard the low, serious tones of Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley in conversation. Bingley was defending the reputation of the local community, which Darcy had clearly mocked. "They are good-hearted people, Darcy, even if they lack the polish of London society," Bingley insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "And Miss Bennet surely is perfect consequence in herself, regardless of her connections." There was a heavy pause, and then Darcy's voice, colder and more precise than the winter air, cut across the silence. "Bingley, you are deliberately blind to the realities of consequence. Jane Bennet's beauty and sweetness are undeniable, and I grant that I see her as a woman of superior mind, far surpassing the common run. But we must consider the unavoidable liabilities." Elizabeth felt a sudden chill, dropping her book silently onto the carpet. She knew with a certainty that turned her stomach that they spoke of her sister. "It is not Jane herself, but the circumstances that attend her," Darcy continued, his tone that of a man laying out facts for a slow pupil. "Consider the matter practically. A man of your estate must look to the future lineage. What of the noise and notoriety that spring from merit in itself? What of the vulgarity of the mother, which is quite indefensible? And the 3 unmarried younger daughters who run wild without restraint? These things cast a shadow, Charles. They attach an unfortunate stain to the family name." Bingley murmured a protest, something about affection transcending such things. But Darcy crushed the idealism instantly. "Affection is blind, but the world is not. And there is the matter of the trade connections. To associate with the mercantile class in Cheapside, your future wife's aunt residing in such a locale, subject to the gossip and scrutiny of those who expect better." He paused, a sigh of aristocratic disapproval following. "The truth, Charles, is that the vulgarity of the Bennet family in general, and the deplorable lack of decorum in Mrs. Bennet and her 3 younger girls in particular, have reduced the probability of both Miss Bennet and Miss Elizabeth ever truly marrying well. They are weighed down by the deficiencies of their relations. It is a terrible pity, for Miss Elizabeth possesses a mind that might otherwise render her attractive, but her situation is utterly hopeless." The word struck Elizabeth not as a personal insult, but as a devastating, objective assessment of their fate. Jane's hopes, and her own, were not merely contingent upon character or fortune, but were irrevocably compromised by the sins of their social standing, by the loud, embarrassing figure of Mrs. Bennet, and by the decent, hard-working figure of their uncle, the tradesman. Elizabeth stood up stiffly, her breath caught in her throat. She did not wait for Bingley's soft, perhaps inadequate defense. She slipped away, her cheeks burning with a mixture of shame, fury, and painful acknowledgement. Darcy had been cruel, but he had spoken the uncompromising truth of their world. Her opinion of Mr. Darcy, already low, now solidified into utter detestation. He was not merely proud, he was insufferably arrogant and unforgivably unforgiving. She had seen the truth of her sister's excellent prospects with Mr. Bingley confirmed. She had also, in the drafty library of Netherfield, received the confirmation of her own and Jane's indelible disadvantage, a stain which, according to the great Mr. Darcy, no amount of merit could ever fully wash away. The drawing room at Longbourn, though usually a haven of quiet domesticity, hummed with a different sort of energy. Elizabeth Bennet, her cheeks flushed and eyes bright with indignation, paced the worn carpet, her mind still reeling from the intimate confidence Mr. Wickham had bestowed upon her. Every word he had uttered, recounting Mr. Darcy's profound cruelty and injustice, had struck a chord with her already established ill opinion of the gentleman. "It is beyond belief, Jane," she exclaimed, finally stopping before her sister, who sat engaged in her needlework, her brow furrowed with gentle concern. To think such a man could exist, cloaked in an air of consequence and propriety, yet harboring such a black heart. Jane laid down her embroidery, her expression soft but serious. "What has occurred, dearest Lizzie? You seem quite distressed." Elizabeth launched into the tale, her words tumbling out in a torrent of outrage. "Mr. Wickham, Jane, the most amiable and deserving of men. He confided in me, he told me of Mr. Darcy's monstrous betrayal. How old Mr. Darcy, in his will, earnestly desired that young Wickham should enter into the church, and bequeathed him a living, a very handsome one, that would have secured his future." She paused, taking a breath to fuel her indignation. "But that odious Mr. Darcy, out of sheer malice, out of envy for a man he saw as his father's favorite, refused to honor the will. He denied Wickham his rightful inheritance, leaving him to languish in poverty, despite Wickham's clear claim and his inherent goodness. Did you ever hear of such a despicable act, such cold-blooded, unprincipled cruelty?" Elizabeth's eyes flashed. "It confirms everything I ever felt about him, Jane. His pride, his arrogance, his disdain for everyone around him. It is not merely ill-breeding, but a truly villainous disposition. To deliberately ruin a man so deserving, a man who merely sought to follow his benefactor's last wishes. It is unforgivable." Jane listened patiently, her calm nature a marked contrast to Elizabeth's fiery spirit. When Elizabeth had finished, Jane sighed, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. "Indeed, Lizzie, if what Mr. Wickham says is true, it is a most regrettable affair," Jane began, her voice gentle. "But are you quite certain of it? Mr. Wickham is a stranger to us, and though he seems a most agreeable young man, one should be cautious of forming such a strong judgment upon a single account." Elizabeth frowned, a little annoyed by Jane's measured response. Cautious? Jane, his candor, his evident distress, his very lack of bitterness, while recounting such an injury, it speaks volumes. He has nothing to gain by fabricating such a tale, and everything to lose by such a powerful enemy as Mr. Darcy. Jane's gaze, however, remained thoughtful. "Perhaps so. But Lizzie, you know that I have always endeavored to see the best in everyone, and while Mr. Darcy may appear reserved, even proud to some, I must confess that I have always found him to be a most respectable and honest gentleman in my own brief acquaintance with him." Elizabeth stared. "Respectable? Honest? Jane, how can you possibly speak so, after what I have just told you? Is denying a man his rightful inheritance, his very means of livelihood, the act of an honest man? I do not speak of this specific accusation, of which I know nothing save what you have told me," Jane clarified gently. "But in the general course of his behavior, in his interactions with us and with Mr. Bingley, I have rarely observed anything that suggested such profound perfidy. He was always perfectly civil to me, and indeed seemed a man of sense and principle. It is difficult for me to reconcile such a character with the actions Mr. Wickham describes." She rose and approached her sister, taking Elizabeth's hand. "My dearest Lizzie, your feelings are often so strong, and I admire your quickness to defend the wronged. But sometimes our first impressions can be mistaken, and even the most amiable appearances can conceal much. I only ask that you regard Mr. Darcy with an open mind, and consider that there may be circumstances we do not yet understand, or that perhaps Mr. Wickham, though a good man, may have been mistaken in some particular." Elizabeth pulled her hand away, shaking her head. Open mind, Jane. Were I to remain open-minded after hearing such a monstrous tale, I would have no moral compass at all. How you can cling to such a favorable opinion of him after this, I cannot comprehend. You are simply too good, too ready to believe everyone perfect. Yet despite her firm resolve and passionate conviction, Jane's quiet words settled like a persistent, unwelcome whisper in the back of Elizabeth's mind. Jane, who rarely erred in her judgment of character, who saw goodness where others saw only fault, had found Mr. Darcy respectable. It was a small, unsettling discord in the otherwise clear harmony of Elizabeth's righteous anger. She decided at least to try to follow the advice of her sister. Chapter 3. The chandeliers of Netherfield Park blazed with 1,000 tiny flames, casting a golden hue over a scene of bustling gaiety. Elizabeth Bennet, her eyes sparkling with animation, had been enjoying the evening despite the usual vexations of her family. She had even found herself observing Mr. Darcy across the room, a man whose proud demeanor simultaneously irked and fascinated her. As the musicians struck up a new set, a ripple went through the assembly. Mr. Darcy, the notoriously reserved and aloof master of Pemberley, was seen approaching Elizabeth. Her brow creased in mild surprise, anticipating some new slight or perhaps a cutting remark. Instead, he stopped directly before her, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Bennet," he began, his voice low, "may I have the honor of this dance?" Elizabeth was momentarily stunned. A dance? With him? The surprise was so absolute that for a fraction of a second, she considered refusing, then thought better of it. Curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of defiance, stirred within her. "Mr. Darcy," she replied, a faint challenge in her tone, "I assure you I am as astonished as anyone to receive such an invitation." She paused then, with a slight nod, added, "However, I accept." As he led her to the floor, a hush seemed to fall over the immediate vicinity, and Elizabeth could feel the weight of countless curious glances. The first movements of the dance were stiff, a formal choreography of polite distance. Yet, as their hands met and parted, as they turned and bowed, something shifted. Darcy's hand, though firm, was not unpleasant. His gaze, though serious, lacked the overt disdain she had come to expect. For a fleeting moment, Elizabeth almost found herself entertained, almost pleased by the sheer audacity of this unexpected turn of events. But then, as he led her through a particularly intricate figure, the memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through her burgeoning composure. Wickham's smooth, earnest voice echoed in her mind. "He ruined me, Miss Bennet, denied me the living, left me to penury, all out of pure, unadulterated spite." The image of Wickham's handsome, wronged face superimposed itself over Darcy's own, and the fleeting warmth in Elizabeth's chest turned instantly cold. Her smile, which had been on the verge of genuine, faded to a mere politeness, then vanished altogether. The disdain which she believed she had thoroughly conquered rushed back with a renewed, bitter force. How could she have forgotten? How could she have allowed herself to be lulled by a mere dance, a polite gesture, when this man was capable of such profound cruelty? "Mr. Darcy," she began, her voice low and cutting, "you speak of honor, yet there are tales circulating that paint a very different picture of your character." His steps faltered almost imperceptibly, his dark brow knitting. "Indeed, Miss Bennet, and pray tell, what tales are these?" His tone was carefully neutral, but a hint of warning was perceptible beneath it. "Tales of a young man, a promising clergyman, cruelly deprived of his rightful inheritance, all by your hands," she pressed, her eyes flashing. "A man who, by his own account, was wronged beyond measure." Darcy's jaw tightened. "Wickham," he stated rather than asked, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "You refer to Mr. Wickham." "I do, and I confess, after hearing his account, I find it difficult to reconcile your present civility with such actions." He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering, almost challenging. "Miss Bennet, I assure you you would do well not to trust a single word Mr. Wickham utters." Elizabeth scoffed, a short, sharp sound. And why should I not? His story was compelling, his distress evident. Yours, however, is a mere dismissal. Would you care to elaborate, Mr. Darcy? Or is your explanation simply that he is a liar and you are above reproach? A muscle twitched in his cheek. He maintained his composed silence for a moment longer than was comfortable, his eyes searching hers, perhaps for a sign he might offer defense. But Elizabeth offered only a resolute, challenging stare. I have no doubt Mr. Wickham has painted a vivid picture, Darcy finally said, his voice clipped. But I assure you, it is a false one. I have no intention of discussing my private affairs with him, or indeed with anyone, on a public dance floor. So you refuse to explain? Her voice was barely a whisper, but it vibrated with frustration and anger. You expect me to simply accept your word over his, with no justification, no explanation, nothing but your pride? My word, Miss Bennet, should be sufficient, he returned, his own pride evident in every syllable. And I advise you again, do not trust Wickham. The music swelled around them, carrying the gaiety of the ball. But for Elizabeth, it was a discordant racket. Her hands clenched. This man, so arrogant, so dismissive, so utterly convinced of his own rightness. He had asked her to dance, seemingly offered a moment of truce, only to reinforce every prejudiced notion she held against him. As the final notes of the set faded, and the couples bowed, Darcy offered her a stiff, formal nod. Thank you for the dance, Miss Bennet. Elizabeth, however, did not return the politeness. Her face was flushed, her eyes blazing with indignation. Without a word, without a glance, she turned sharply on her heel and walked away, her steps swift and purposeful, leaving Mr. Darcy standing alone on the dance floor, a picture of aristocratic rigidity amidst the swirling silks and laughter. Her anger, hot and unforgiving, burned within her, eclipsing every other sentiment. She had indeed danced with Mr. Darcy, but the encounter had only deepened the chasm between them. Chapter 4. The drawing room at Longbourn was, as usual, a cheerful chaos of half-finished projects and whispered plans. Jane, a delicate blush rising on her cheeks, was stitching a particularly vibrant rose onto a piece of muslin, her thoughts no doubt at Netherfield. Elizabeth was attempting to read a novel, occasionally glancing up to tease her sisters. Kitty and Lydia were giggling over some fresh silliness, while Mary hummed a doleful tune at the spinet. The domestic peace was shattered by a shriek that could only belong to one person. Mrs. Bennet burst into the room, her cap askew, her face a blotchy crimson, and her entire frame trembling with a manufactured hysteria that still managed to send a chill down Elizabeth's spine. "Oh, my poor nerves," she wailed, collapsing onto the nearest sofa with a dramatic gasp. "My poor, poor nerves! We are all undone, utterly, irrevocably undone. My poor daughters, to be so cruelly disappointed, to be so shamefully neglected." Kitty and Lydia's giggles died. Mary's humming ceased. Jane's needle froze mid-stitch, the vibrant rose suddenly seeming quite faded. Elizabeth merely lowered her book, a familiar, resigned sigh escaping her lips. This level of drama could only signal a disaster of matrimonial proportions. "Mama," Jane said, rising with gentle concern, her earlier blush now fading to a distinct pallor. "What is the matter? Has something happened to Papa?" "Worse, child, far, far worse," Mrs. Bennet wrung her hands. "It is Mr. Bingley. He is gone, I tell you. And his sisters, and that odious Mr. Darcy, they have all left Netherfield, to London, and they are not expected to return for a very, very long time, perhaps never." She buried her face in a lace handkerchief, her sobs echoing theatrically. A stunned silence fell. Even Kitty and Lydia seemed to grasp the enormity of this blow. Jane's face, a moment before so alight with delicate hope, now crumpled, her eyes welling with unshed tears. The embroidery hoops slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered softly to the floor. Elizabeth, however, felt a strange, cold sense of confirmation rather than shock. A premonition, a quiet unease, had been simmering within her for weeks. She met her mother's wild, tear-streaked gaze with an uncharacteristic calmness, though a fierce anger began to ignite behind her eyes. "I knew it, Mama," Elizabeth said, her voice steady, though a bitter tang laced her words. "Somehow I knew it. Mr. Darcy would never allow Bingley to remain here, not when a match with Jane was becoming so obviously desirable. He always disapproved of us, of our connections, of everything that was not grand and fashionable enough for his lofty standards." Her lip curled with disdain. "He has certainly convinced Mr. Bingley not to return. He has too much influence over his friend, and clearly Mr. Bingley has too little mind of his own." Mrs. Bennet threw up her hands in fresh despair. "Oh, Lizzie, how can you speak so callously? To say you knew it when your poor sister's heart is being broken before your very eyes. And Mr. Darcy, what has he to do with it? He is simply a proud, disagreeable man who cares for no one but himself." Jane, who had been listening with a face etched in profound pain, now looked up. Her blue eyes were brimming, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek, but her chin, to Elizabeth's surprise, was held high. Her voice, though soft, was remarkably clear and firm. "No, Mama. No, Elizabeth. You cannot know that for certain. Mr. Bingley is a kind, good man. He just seems to need time to make up his mind. He will surely return after that. He would not leave without a reason that he believes to be good." She paused, swallowing hard, and then, with a flicker of surprising resolve, added, "And if, after all, he does not return, then I shall find an even better man." Elizabeth stared at her sister, a wave of admiration and fierce protectiveness washing over her. Even in profound hurt, Jane's innate goodness and quiet strength shone through, a beacon of dignity. Mrs. Bennet, however, looked scandalized. "An even better man?" she squawked, rising from the sofa, aghast. "Jane Bennet, are you quite mad? Where on earth will you find a man with 10,000 a year and 4 or 5,000 pounds at his immediate disposal, who is also so agreeable? This is no time for such foolish talk. You are to be miserable. We are all to be miserable, and it is all Mr. Darcy's fault and the entail and our unfortunate connections." Chapter 5. 4 months later. The air in Meryton Church was thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and damp wool. Sunlight, fractured through the arched, somewhat dusty windows, slanted onto Elizabeth Bennet's bonnet, warming the crown of her head. She sat uneasily on the hard pew, wedged between the serene composure of Jane and the rustling restlessness of her mother. Elizabeth's thoughts were a tangled skein of recent disappointments. The departure of the Netherfield party, the perceived slight to Jane, and the general uncertainty of her family's future weighed heavily. She found herself habitually replaying conversations, seeking confirmation of the ill-breeding or arrogance she had so readily attached to certain high-ranking individuals. Today the parson, a mild man, usually given to long, soporific discourses on agricultural metaphors, spoke with an unexpected, pointed intensity. His subject was the immense, unseen architecture of the human mind. "Brethren," the parson declared, adjusting his spectacles, "we often believe that our lives are ruled by circumstance, by fate, or by the actions of others. But Holy Scripture teaches us that the very foundation of our reality is laid not outside us but within the walls of our own minds." He leaned slightly over the pulpit. "Consider the lament of Job, a man consumed by suffering. We read in the 3rd chapter, verse 25, "For the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me." Elizabeth felt a sudden, sharp prick of recognition. She had been so afraid of folly and pride in others, so determined to guard herself against imposition, that she often perceived little else. She had feared haughty judgment, and lo, she had found it. Or perhaps she had sought it out until it manifested. Was it possible that her own entrenched fears dictated what she saw? The parson continued, pressing the point. "Our thoughts are powerful, yes, but dangerous when left silent. For when we give our thoughts flight, when we articulate them, their power is multiplied tenfold. The tongue is a dreadful engine." Elizabeth's spine stiffened. She was famed for her quick wit, her sharp rejoinders. a facility she had often mistaken for wisdom. Proverbs 18 verse 21 warns us, death and life are in the power of the tongue. And James adds emphasis, comparing the tongue to a small fire, yet one that boasts great things. The sharp word, the hasty condemnation, the witty but wounding observation. These are sparks, brethren, that can consume not only the reputation of others, but the peace of our own soul. Elizabeth instantly saw the image of the drawing room at Netherfield, the memory of her own cutting sarcasm directed at Mr. Darcy. She had flattered herself on her discernment, yet perhaps she had merely exercised her prejudice in her tongue, fueling the very pride she sought to despise. This rhetorical fire was building to a crucial application. The parson's gaze swept over the congregation, settling momentarily near the Bennet pew. "And here is a truth both humbling and terrifying," he announced. "The way we habitually think of others fundamentally directs their behavior in our presence. If we assume vanity, we receive vanity. If we expect deception, we find only guardedness. We cast a shadow of suspicion, and the man or woman we judge steps readily into that shade." Elizabeth swallowed, her face warm beneath her bonnet. She had judged Mr. Darcy as cold, arrogant, and unbearable, and in her presence he had consistently acted the part she had assigned him. Had her own critical lens blinded her to any deeper character? The sermon softened, moving from stern warning to profound encouragement. The parson spoke of a loftier pattern of thought, the divine pattern. "We are told that the Almighty does not look upon us with suspicion or judgment, but with a mighty, overwhelming hope," he said, his voice now imbued with gentle wonder. "Hear the words of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 29, verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future." He paused, letting the magnitude of the verse settle. God's initial thought about us is positive. God, who knows all our weaknesses, still believes, as far as ever possible, that we are faithful, capable, and that we will not fail. He believes in our potential over our present failing. This belief, this inherent charity of thought, is the very pattern we are commanded to follow. Mrs. Bennet snorted faintly, having been deep in contemplation of her bonnet ribbon. But Elizabeth was riveted. It was a principle so contrary to her own cynical nature. She sought truth by tearing away pretension. God sought truth by assuming the best and building upon that foundation. "Therefore, dear flock," the parson concluded, folding his hands upon the worn Bible, "let us learn to select our thoughts with the utmost diligence. Let us emulate this divine charity. Let us turn from the habit of seeking flaws and instead obey the mandate given to us in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. He recited the final instruction, clear and powerful. "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." The hymn was sung, the blessing given, and the congregation began the slow, rustling exodus from the pews. Elizabeth stood in a daze, the sermon echoing in her mind. As she stepped out into the bright Meriden street, the parson's words had not solved her problems, but they had revealed a deep flaw in her own. Her lively, discerning mind, which she had prized so highly, was not guided by truth, nobility, or charity. It was guided by the satisfying sting of her own prejudice. Whatever is true, whatever is noble. Elizabeth walked home, resolving to take the first difficult steps toward changing her internal architecture. She would test this premise. She would, beginning at once, suspend judgment, and she would attempt to seek the noble, the true, and the admirable in every person she met, even in the image of that proud, disagreeable gentleman from Pemberley. The change, she knew, would not be instantaneous, but the silence of her judgmental thoughts felt like the first breath of a new kind of freedom. She had been commanded to think differently, and Elizabeth Bennet, for the first time, recognized that the greatest challenge to her own happiness lay not in the faults of others, but in the fierce, uncharitable authority of her own mind. Chapter 6. The afternoon light, mellow and golden, slanted through the window of Elizabeth Bennet's room at Longbourn, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. But Elizabeth herself saw none of it. Her gaze was fixed on a point in the middle distance, her mind far away, wrestling with a truth both unsettling and profoundly illuminating. She had spent weeks, months even, dissecting her own judgment, her pride, her prejudices. But a new layer of understanding had begun to surface, a deeper current beneath the familiar tides of self-reproach. It was not merely that her expectations had directed her feelings and decisions. It was that they seemed, insidiously, to tempt people to act according to them. She thought of Jane, her sweet, guileless sister. Jane had gone into the Meryton assembly, indeed, into every social encounter, expecting to meet amiable gentlemen, to find goodness and kindness in all, and lo, she had met such. Bingley, with his open countenance and ready smile, had been the very embodiment of the amiable gentleman Jane had been predisposed to welcome. Jane's benevolent expectations had, in a way, smoothed the path for such individuals to appear and flourish in her company. And then there was Darcy. Ah, Darcy. Elizabeth had expected him to be proud, aloof, arrogant, and indeed he had presented himself as such. She had expected him to view her family with disdain, and he had. She had expected him to take Bingley with him to London, to spirit him away from Jane and their less than advantageous connections, and not to return. And precisely as she had anticipated, he had done so. Her expectations, she now saw, had woven a narrative that had, for a time, seemed to perfectly unfold. It was as if her very conviction of his character had given him no other choice but to fulfill it. But that, she now realized with a jolt, had not been an automatic pattern. It was not a law of the universe, but a dangerous oversimplification. For there, in the quiet, dust-filled air of her room, another truth asserted itself, one that shattered the comfortable, if chastening, logic of her previous thoughts. She had not expected that Mr. Darcy would admire her. She had not for one moment conceived of it. Every interaction, every cutting remark, every judgmental glance had reinforced her belief in his contempt. Never in her wildest imaginings had she expected that he would propose to her, as he had done with such passionate, if ill-judged, vehemence at Rosings Park. That memory, raw and still capable of stirring indignation and shame, now served a new purpose. It was the undeniable proof that her neat theory had a gaping, magnificent hole. Her expectations, however strong, however deeply held, were not omnipotent. They did not always dictate the actions of others. Indeed, sometimes, the profoundest, most genuine sentiments defied all prediction, all preconceived notions. It was a sobering thought, but also liberating. It meant that even when she had been most determined to dislike him, most convinced of his faults, a different, truer reality had been brewing beneath the surface. It meant that people, Darcy chief among them, possessed an inner life, a will, and a capacity for feeling that transcended her own judgments and expectations. And in that realization, as the golden light faded and shadows lengthened in her room, Elizabeth felt a new, profound humility bloom within her, entwined with a tentative, unfamiliar hope. The world and the hearts of men within it were far more complex and perhaps far more wonderful than she had ever dared to imagine. The afternoon sun, usually a cheerful companion in her room, seemed muted, its light struggling through the heavy curtains. Elizabeth Bennet sat by the window, a dusty, forgotten air about her. Her fingers, restless, had strayed to a small, seldom-opened writing desk, and there, beneath a pile of old invitations and an unfinished embroidery, she had found it. The letter. Darcy's letter. A cold shiver, not entirely unpleasant this time, traced its way down her spine. She remembered the first reading, a tempest of indignation that had raged through her heart, each word a fresh insult, each explanation a further proof of his abominable pride. She had dismissed it, not even read it wholly, scorned it, torn it to shreds in her mind, even as the physical paper remained intact. It had been an object of detestation, a monument to his arrogance and her own wounded vanity. Now, months later, with the dust of that initial fury settled, Elizabeth felt an inexplicable pull to reread it. She unfolded the crisp paper, the elegant handwriting a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions it had once stirred. Her eyes scanned the familiar lines, but this time they saw beyond the anger, beyond the prejudice that had so willfully blinded her. I will not attempt to deny that in the affairs of my friend Mr. Bingley, with your eldest sister, I did take a most decided part. The first time she had tasted gall, how dared he interfere? How dared he judge Jane, her gentle, faultless Jane? But now Elizabeth paused. She thought of Jane's quiet nature, her reluctance to show strong affection. She recalled her own family's boisterousness, her mother's vulgarity, her younger sister's impropriety. Had not Darcy warned her of her family's want of propriety? Could she truthfully say that a man of Darcy's standing, looking at her family through prejudiced but not entirely unreasonable eyes, might not see cause for concern regarding his friend? He had written, "Her indifference, however, he would formerly have allowed to be natural. But your family's want of propriety, so very marked in the two youngest and in your mother, I had not thought it advisable to promote the establishment of a friend with a connection so much beneath him." Her face flushed, but not with anger, with a different kind of heat, a dawning shame. He had been proud, yes, and his expression of it offensive. But his intent, as she now read it, was to protect his friend from what he genuinely believed would be an unsuitable and perhaps damaging alliance. He had misjudged Jane, severely so, but his underlying motivation, stripped of its arrogant veneer, was one of loyalty. Had she not herself often been mortified by her family's behavior? Then came the second part, the damning account of Wickham. Mr. Wickham's father was a most respectable man, my father's steward. Mr. Wickham, however, was in possession of all that enchanting gaiety so amiable to you. She remembered Wickham's charming smiles, his mournful tales, her own unwavering belief in his victimhood. How readily she had condemned Darcy based on Wickham's insidious whispers. Now, with the dark shadow of Lydia's fate looming, and Wickham's true character undeniably revealed, she read Darcy's words with a terrifying clarity. His chief object was, unquestionably, my sister's fortune, which takes place in the event of her marriage by a clause in my father's will, and a very considerable sum it is. But towards me, an offense of a still heavier nature was committed. Mr. Wickham's first object was to secure her fortune. His second was to injure my reputation. The words painted a picture of calculated villainy. He detailed Wickham's dissipated life, his refusal of the living, his demands for more money, his subsequent attempt to elope with Georgiana, a girl of 15, trusting and vulnerable. Darcy's writing here was not haughty, but etched with a deep, protective pain. He spoke of his sister's distress, the betrayal of her trust, the near ruin of her reputation. Elizabeth's breath hitched. She remembered Wickham's evasiveness when she had once pressed him for details, his smooth deflection, his convenient departures from Meryton whenever Darcy was near. It was all a pattern, a carefully constructed lie, and she, in her self-assured discernment, had fallen for it completely. She had believed the charming villain and condemned the honorable man. The truth of Darcy's account resonated with the terrible reality of Wickham's current actions. His dealings with Lydia, the manipulation, the financial greed, it mirrored exactly what Darcy had painstakingly outlined about Georgiana. She finished the letter, her hands trembling, not with anger, but with a profound, unsettling realization. The man who had written this letter was not the arrogant, cold-hearted brute she had so confidently envisioned. He was a man deeply burdened by responsibility, fiercely protective of his family, and yes, socially awkward and proud, but undeniably honorable. He had laid bare his own perceived faults, his pride, his judgment of her family, even as he defended his actions. There was a raw honesty in his confession, a vulnerable integrity that she had been utterly incapable of seeing before. The picture she held now of Fitzwilliam Darcy was startlingly different. She saw a man who loved his sister so fiercely he would swallow his pride and pen such a detailed, humiliating account to an enemy. She saw a man whose loyalty to his friend blinded him to Jane's true feelings, but whose motive was pure. She saw a man who, despite his immense wealth and standing, had suffered a deep personal wound at Wickham's hands, and whose quiet, reserved manner was perhaps a shield for a sensitive and deeply moral conscience. Her own prejudice, once her most cherished possession, now felt like a heavy, suffocating weight. She had judged him, not on facts but on first impressions, on the word of a known scoundrel, and on the dictates of her own wounded pride. He hadn't just explained himself in that letter. He had quietly, unknowingly, exposed her own failings. A wave of compassion, unexpected and overwhelming, washed over her. She saw not the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, but a decent, honorable man, imperfect in his expression, but driven by good intentions. And she, Elizabeth Bennet, had scorned him, insulted him, and sent him away with contempt. The letter, once a symbol of his offense, was now a mirror reflecting her own blindness, and in its pages, a new, unforeseen admiration for Mr. Darcy began to bloom. Chapter 7. The stout stone walls of the Lambton Inn offered a comforting silence, a necessary insulation after the extraordinary demands of the day. Elizabeth sat by the hearth in her private parlor, the single candle throwing warm, flickering squares into the worn wooden table. She drew a deep, contented breath, allowing the memory of the past hours to wash over her, a strange mixture of mortification and triumph. It had been a day of fate, neatly dividing her calendar into before Pemberley and after Pemberley. She lifted her cooling cup of tea, a slow smile stealing across her face, triggered by a highly unwelcome recollection. How absurd it was to trace her great adventure back to the pulpit of Meryton. She recalled the parson, a man whose voice was habitually pitched to the drone of an ancient gnat, preaching a sermon about Job, focusing particularly on that lament of profound despair. For the thing which I greatly feared has come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me. Now she almost laughed aloud at the irony. That solemn dread had been fulfilled in the most mundane, English, drawing-room manner possible. Her greatest contemporary fear, the social catastrophe she had silently petitioned against with every turnpike mile, had been the confrontation with Mr. Darcy. She had arrived in Derbyshire, confident of her safety. The housekeeper had assured her party that Mr. Darcy was absent. He was expected in London, or perhaps had prolonged his visit to friends. Pemberley, therefore, was merely a grand museum, a piece of architectural curiosity that she could inspect without the hazard of meeting its master. The very thought of being trapped in his presence had filled her with a subtle, visceral terror. How awkward the silence would be, how terrible the scrutiny of those dark eyes, reviewing her past impertinence and the spectacular rejection of his proposal. She had feared the cold formality, the stiff courtesy masking open disdain, the overwhelming sense of her own social inferiority within the hallowed grounds of his home. And yet there he was. The sudden, horrifying reality of his presence in the very entry hall of Pemberley, dripping wet from a swim, had caused the breath to seize in her throat. The fulfillment of the dreadful prophecy was instantaneous. The thing which I greatly feared has come upon me. She had braced herself for the cutting sarcasm, the haughty reserve, the punishing glance. She had prepared for the most difficult half hour of her existence. But the encounter had been anything but difficult. The mirth she felt now was not merely at the fulfillment of the joke, but at the astonishing revelation of the man himself. Darcy's surprise had been genuine, the shock flickering briefly in his eyes, but it had instantly given way to something utterly unexpected. Not arrogance, but anxiety. He had immediately divested himself of every shade of haughtiness that she had ever attributed to him. He was courteous, yes, but in a manner that was solicitous, almost trembling in his eagerness to please. He spoke to her friends with civility, inquired after her family, and, most strikingly, his manner towards Elizabeth herself was one of quiet, earnest respect. Where was the proud, insolent man who had ruined her sister's happiness and insulted her family? He was gone. In his place stood a gentleman revealed in a quite new light, friendly, amiable, and possessed of a startling degree of humility. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, the day's tensions finally untangling. She had feared a tyrant and had found a host. She had feared a judge and had found a penitent. The social humiliation she had dreaded had become, instead, a profound personal absolution. She realized that the entire day had been a carefully constructed inversion of her prejudice. She had gone to Pemberley fearing to meet a man that would disdain her. Instead, she had encountered the man himself and discovered that she had been entirely wrong. Job was correct, she murmured to the empty room, a soft, amused whisper. But what he feared brought ruin. What I feared has brought hope. The great dread had come, but it had brought with it not calamity, but clarity. She drank the last of her tea, the coldness no longer mattering. The evening solitude of the Lambton Inn was sweet, filled with the undeniable, exhilarating knowledge that the day had not merely been eventful, but revolutionary. She had met Mr. Darcy, and the acquaintance, against all her expectations, might yet become the foundational joy of her life. Chapter 8. The oppressive weight of Elizabeth's fears, a burden she had unknowingly carried for weeks, finally cracked under the harsh light of reality. The ink on Jane's letters, stark and damning, seemed to bleed across the page, each word a fresh stab to her already anxious heart. Lydia had eloped with Wickham, and, most devastatingly, no hope of marriage. Elizabeth's breath hitched, a ragged sound in the otherwise quiet drawing room. She could almost hear the echoes of her own desperate pleas to her father, her voice trembling with a conviction she had rarely felt so acutely. "Papa, pray do not allow it. Lydia is too young, too impetuous. Without our eyes upon her, without the steadying influence of home, she will surely bring disgrace upon us all." Her father, ever indulgent, had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand, murmuring about the invigorating sea air and the necessity of a little gaiety for his youngest daughter. And now the gaiety had curdled into a scandal that threatened to engulf them all. The letters detailed a sordid tale of whispered promises, clandestine meetings, and a swift, reckless flight from Brighton. Jane, ever the diplomat, had handled the matter with her usual grace, but the facts were stark and undeniable. Lydia, her flighty, charming, utterly foolish sister, had thrown herself headlong into ruin, and in doing so had dragged the entire Bennet family down with her. Elizabeth traced the elegant script of Jane's handwriting, her mind replaying every instance of Lydia's willful disregard for propriety, every flirtatious glance, every careless word that had hinted at the precipice upon which she teetered. She remembered the giddy excitement surrounding Lydia's departure, a stark contrast to her own gnawing unease. While her mother had been consumed with packing silks and ribbons, Elizabeth had felt a prickle of dread, a shadow lengthening over the anticipated merriment. Now the cloud had burst, and its tempest had swept away their reputation, their dignity, and any semblance of peace. The implications were chilling. An elopement with a man like Wickham, without the promise of marriage, meant one thing: ruin. For Lydia, it meant a compromised future, a life of hardship and whispered scandal. For the family, it meant the crushing weight of social disgrace, a stain that would be impossible to wash away. Their already precarious position in society would crumble entirely. Elizabeth's gaze drifted to the window, the familiar green expanse of the Lambton garden suddenly seeming alien and mocking. She had tried. She had seen the storm gathering and had tried to warn them. But her warnings had been dismissed as overzealousness, her fears as the product of a too serious disposition. Now her fears had not just been realized, they had manifested in the most destructive way imaginable. She reread a passage from Jane's letter, her eyes blurring slightly. "Mr. Wickham has made no proposal for her hand, nor has he any intention of doing so." They had been living as man and wife, though no ceremony has taken place. The words struck Elizabeth with a physical force, stealing the air from her lungs. This was not a youthful indiscretion. This was a deliberate defiance of all that was decent and respectable. A profound weariness settled over her. The fight, the spirited arguments, The pursuit of independent thought that had defined so much of her character felt hollow in the face of this utter, irrefutable disaster. Her father's indulgence, her mother's vanity, Lydia's recklessness, they had all conspired to create this nightmare. And Elizabeth, who had seen it coming, was powerless to undo it. The reality was a bitter pill, far more potent than any fear she had ever harbored. Lydia's folly had indeed ruined the whole family. The dream had shattered the moment the letter arrived, its seal bearing the frantic hand of Jane. And Mr. Darcy, who had been standing beside her then, discussing some triviality of Derbyshire scenery, had been witness to the terrifying transformation of her composure. She recalled the sequence with agonizing clarity. The first lines, revealing Lydia's reckless elopement with Wickham, the dizzying rush of mortification and fear, and then, looking up, the sight of Darcy's countenance. It had been filled not with his customary reserve, but with shock and the deepest possible distress, a sympathy so profound it seemed to mirror her own agony. But then the sympathy had been swallowed whole, replaced by a terrible urgency. He had stayed only long enough to confirm the essential, ruinous fact, his eyes searching hers with a conflicted gravity. And then he was gone. A brief, muttered explanation about business in town, a stiff farewell to the gardeners, and the sound of his carriage wheels retreating down the drive. A sound that, to Elizabeth's heart, was the final, irreversible snap of hope. She had come to like him, more than like him. She had discovered the true goodness beneath his haughty exterior. She had admired his integrity, cherished his genuine humility in confessing his past errors, and felt the exhilarating possibility of a future shared with a mind she could respect and a heart she could begin to love. Now their future was an impossibility. The disgrace of the family, the public shame of Lydia's immorality, clung to Elizabeth like a contagion. Mr. Darcy, the proud master of Pemberley, could not propose to a woman whose sister was a publicized ruin. He had departed swiftly and silently because the very foundation of his life, reputation, honor, and family standing, forbade his lingering near the scandal. His leaving, she understood with a grim finality, was the ultimate signal that he was lost to her. A fresh wave of wretchedness swept over her, not only for the present disaster, but for the part of her character that had always dreaded it. Her mind turned tortuously upon itself. Could my fears have been the cause? She wondered, pressing her temples with trembling fingers. Had my own dark speculations somehow summoned the reality? She remembered the countless times she had worried over her mother's foolish indulgence of Kitty and Lydia, the unseemly flirtations in Meryton, the utter lack of discipline in their household. She had warned her father, urged him to separate the girls from the dissipations of the regiment. She had felt with cold certainty the creeping danger of their environment. She had felt a true presentiment of ruin. But a presentiment, she quickly concluded, was not a precursor to guilt. She feared the fire, yes, because she saw the careless arrangement of kindling. Her apprehension was born of a clear-sighted appraisal of the facts, of Lydia's inherent recklessness, her father's negligence, and the vicious nature of the world that preyed upon such folly. She had been powerless to change these forces. She had seen the danger. She had not created it. The cause of their ignominy lay solely with Lydia's own incorrigible weakness and the villainy of Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth was distressed. She was mortified. She felt the weight of her family's suffering as keenly as any of them. But she was not responsible for Lydia's deeds. Her conscience, though agonizingly bruised by the external calamity, was clean on that point. This realization offered a small, meager comfort in the vast ocean of her current sorrow. She was morally innocent of the disaster, but she was socially damned by it nonetheless. She rose and walked to the mantelpiece, leaning her head against the cold stone. She was left only with the bitter memory of what might have been, and the profound, aching certainty that the scandal which had swallowed her younger sister had also cost Elizabeth the man she now believed she loved. His hurried departure had closed the door on happiness, a door that, she greatly feared, could never be reopened. Chapter 9. The air in Longbourn was thick with the dust of despair. Summer had yielded to a heat more oppressive than usual, and within the closed drawing room, the temperature was raised further by the continuous damp steam of Mrs. Bennet's grief. Elizabeth sat by the window, ostensibly mending a sleeve, but in truth merely holding the needle captive. The past week had stretched into an eternity of shame. Lydia, her heedless, ruined sister, was gone, and with her, the Bennet family's reputation was slipping into the abyss of irrevocable ignominy. Jane, pale and silent, moved through the house with the mournful grace of a ghost, attending to their father, who remained locked in his study, a sanctuary from his wife's noisy suffering and the painful self-reproach that Elizabeth knew gnawed at him. It was Elizabeth who faced the brunt of it. She bore the weight of the tragedy, not just because her clear sight understood the full horrific consequence of Lydia's folly, but because she was the only one capable of answering her mother's incessant, piercing lamentations. "We are ruined, Lizzie! Utterly, utterly undone!" Mrs. Bennet would cry, tearing at the lace on her cap. "You will never marry now. None of you will. We shall all be turned out upon the lanes, and it is all owing to that horrid, thoughtless girl." Elizabeth would offer balm, logic, or simply silence, knowing that nothing she could say would truly stem the torrent. Her own heart was a tight knot of anxiety and bitterness towards Wickham, the villain whose treachery had led them here. Yet, despite the overwhelming probability of the worst, that Lydia was lost, that Wickham would discard her, that their family would be socially ostracized forever, Elizabeth forced herself to cultivate a tiny, impossible seed of hope. It was a purely pragmatic exercise. If she did not expect some form of external salvation, however improbable, she would succumb to the paralysis of misery. "We must expect a good solution," she counseled herself, pushing down the voice of reason that screamed such a thing was impossible. Someone must intervene. Something must happen. It was a belief built on air, but it kept her holding the needle steady and her countenance composed. It was late in the afternoon when the sound arrived, a furious clatter of hooves on the drive, followed by the heavy, jarring halt of a coach. This was no polite morning call. This was haste, urgency, and consequence. Mrs. Bennet instantly ceased her weeping, her face drawn in terror. "Oh, mercy, is it news? Has she done some terrible thing?" Mr. Bennet emerged from his study, his face grave, his shoulders bowed. A footman rushed in, holding a sealed packet of tremendous size, clearly marked Express, Immediate. The air became utterly still. The rustle of the paper as Mr. Bennet broke the seal sounded like a cannon shot. Elizabeth watched his face, steeling herself for the confirmation of final, utter defeat. Her father began to read, his eyes traveling down the page slowly, deliberately. The color drained from his cheeks, but not in the way one expects when death or disaster is confirmed. It was a stunned, almost unbelieving pallor. He read the final lines twice before handing the letter silently to Elizabeth. "Lizzie," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Read this aloud. I confess, I have never been so astonished." Elizabeth took the paper, her hands trembling. It was from Mr. Gardiner, their sensible uncle in London. She began to read the dense, hurried script. "My dear brother, I write this at the earliest moment possible, having only just concluded the necessary, difficult business. I have succeeded. Lydia is found." A collective gasp escaped the women. Mrs. Bennet pressed a shaking hand to her throat. "With the help of Mr. Darcy, I located them soon after their flight. Wickham, true to his character, had every intention of deserting her, but I secured their whereabouts swiftly. After days of negotiation, and I assure you, the business was exceedingly delicate and costly, we have secured the only possible outcome that could save your family from ruin. Lydia is married." Elizabeth's breath caught fast in her chest. She looked up, unable to comprehend. Jane was weeping silently, but her mother suddenly emitted a high, strangled sound, half sob, half shriek of hope. Elizabeth returned to the letter, her eyes flying over the conclusive lines. "She was wed this morning to George Wickham. The particulars of his inducement must remain private for the moment, but rest assured, he is bound by law. They are now man and wife. The paper dropped from Elizabeth's slack fingers. Married. The single word echoed through her mind, not with joy, but with the dizzying, overwhelming force of a collapsing siege wall. Lydia married to Wickham. The consequences were still dire, the match hideous, the man despicable. But the ruin was averted. The family honor was retrieved. The gates of society were slammed shut, then miraculously, hauled open just enough for them to slip back inside. The burden, which had felt like a crushing stone resting on her very soul, suddenly lifted so violently that Elizabeth felt momentarily weak, lightheaded with the sheer, explosive relief. Mrs. Bennet, whose despair had been so profound, now erupted into a hysterical fit of congratulation. "Married Wickham! Oh, my sweetest Lydia, was there ever such a clever girl? To catch a gentleman so handsome! We are saved! Oh, Mr. Bennet, we are saved!" She sank into her chair, laughing and crying simultaneously, praising Wickham, the rogue, the villain, as the most agreeable son-in-law in England. Elizabeth could not share the joy, only the release. She glanced at her father, who was leaning heavily against the mantelpiece. His expression was exhausted, etched with the knowledge of how deeply they were now indebted and how low they had sunk to achieve this salvation. But the shame was contained. The catastrophe was averted. Elizabeth drew a deep, shuddering breath, tasting the first flicker of genuine relief she had felt in weeks. She had expected the improbable, and against all logic, the improbable had occurred. The miracle, bought, negotiated, and distasteful, had arrived. Longbourn was safe. Chapter 10. The air at Longbourn was heavy with the brittle peace of a crisis averted but not forgotten. Lydia's hasty, unsatisfying wedding had secured the family reputation from total ruin. But for Elizabeth Bennet, the solution was more bewildering than the problem had been. She sat in the small, rarely used drawing room, pretending to mend a tearing in the sleeve of her gown, though her fingers trembled too much for neat work. Mr. Darcy. The name spun in her mind, a jarring chord in the symphony of relief. What role had he played? Her immediate dreadful fear when the elopement was revealed had been that Wickham would escape justice and ruin not only Lydia, but perhaps even taint the periphery of Mr. Darcy's acquaintance, a thought that was now ridiculous, given what she had learned of the man's true character at Rosings. Yet here he was, somehow entangled in the sordid details of a forced marriage, with a man he scorned and utterly disdained. Elizabeth had run every possibility through her mind. Perhaps he had merely been in London and stumbled upon them. Perhaps he felt a duty to his former friend Wickham, however undeserved. No. Darcy's sense of duty was stern, built on honor, not misguided charity for a dissolute rogue. The only remaining hypothesis was so staggering that it made her drop her needle in the carpet. Could he have cared so much for her? She recalled his proposal with a clarity that now brought a burning flush to her cheeks. His passion, his certainty, and her own crushing rejection, based upon his supposed cruelty to Wickham and his treatment of Jane. Her subsequent knowledge had exonerated him entirely, but even then he had walked away, wounded. For him to deliberately seek out Wickham, to wade through the moral mire, to endure the inevitable, tedious bargaining, and, worst of all, to submit himself to the humbling task of treating with a man he despised, knowing such an action could never be trumpeted or praised. It suggested a love that transcended mere affection. It suggested sacrifice. He would have borne all this to save an acquaintance, she whispered to the empty room. No. Every piece of logic led back to her. He had sacrificed his pride to save her from the guilt and despair of her sister's ruin, knowing that her family's final disgrace would destroy her happiness. But then followed the most painful question of all, the one that dampened any rising hope. If it was true, if he loved her so profoundly, would he still bind himself to a family that presented a spectacle of vulgarity at every turn? A family now irrevocably tainted by scandal and debt? The answer, or at least a powerful hint towards it, came during a meeting between Mr. Bennet and Mr. Gardiner in the dining room late that afternoon. Elizabeth, hearing the low rumble of conversation, paused just outside the door, unable to resist eavesdropping on matters of such grave familial consequence. Mr. Bennet was direct, his voice carrying the unusual gravity of genuine financial concern. "Gardner, my dear fellow, I must insist on knowing precisely how much we are indebted to you. This settlement, whatever it cost, I shall begin repaying it immediately, however long it takes." There was a moment of silence. Then Mr. Gardner's clear, measured voice replied, a tone of firm finality ringing within it. "You misunderstand, Bennet, and I fear I erred in allowing you to believe what was most convenient at the time. You owe me nothing, not a single shilling. I was merely the agent, the necessary go-between." Mr. Bennet's astonishment was audible. "You were the agent? But the expense, the immense sum required to make Wickham settle, and the purchase of his commission, who, in heaven's name, bore this financial burden if not you?" Elizabeth froze, her hand gripping the doorframe. Her uncle, usually so easy and open, hesitated noticeably. "Bennet," Mr. Gardner began, choosing his words with unusual care, "I was placed under a promise of the strictest secrecy, and I must not violate it. Suffice it to say, the person who undertook this arrangement was compelled by a motive of the highest honor, and felt a powerful personal interest in preventing the total ruin of your house." "But who?" pressed up Mr. Bennet. "It must be a man of considerable wealth and, forgive me, a man of singular charity." "Was it some old friend? A connection of your own, perhaps?" "No," Mr. Gardner insisted. "It was a burden this gentleman did not need to take upon himself at all, and one which would have crushed your estate. He took the whole financial weight, securing Lydia's marriage and settling Wickham's debts, not for any reward, but solely to ensure the felicity and reputation of those he respected." Elizabeth's breath hitched. The weight of the confirmation pressed down on her senses. It was not chance. It was not duty to a stranger. It was a deliberate, total assumption of their shame and their debt. She pushed the door open, her face pale but her eyes blazing with newfound, humiliating understanding. "Uncle," she said, her voice barely a whisper, forcing both men to look up. "It was Mr. Darcy." Mr. Bennet stared at his daughter, dumbfounded. Mr. Gardner merely sighed, the expression on his face confirming the dreadful truth. "Elizabeth, I promised." "You promised silence, but you cannot promise mystery," she cut in gently. "It bears the stamp of his character entirely. He would not allow you to take the debt. He would not allow himself to be discovered, lest his sacrifice be taken as vanity." She walked slowly into the room, leaning against the cold marble mantelpiece, suddenly seeing the true scope of his earlier actions at Rosings. She had accused him of pride, but what was this act if not the deepest humility? He had sought out the villain who had once attempted to corrupt his sister, secured him with money, and endured the foul business of a forced wedding, purely for her sake. The sacrifice of his fortune was immense, but the sacrifice of his pride was incalculable. He loved her. He must truly love her, for he had laid his honor in the dust to preserve hers. The knowledge brought both an exquisite agony and a profound sense of gratitude. She had misjudged him utterly, casting him aside when he was attempting to secure her family's peace, blinded by her own prejudice. But the final question remained, now sharper and heavier than before. He had done all this to save her from ruin, but in saving her, he had inextricably tied himself to the source of that ruin: Lydia, Wickham, and the eternal absurdity of Mrs. Bennet. Would such a man, having paid the highest price conceivable, truly want to finish his endeavor by binding himself permanently to the source of his humiliation? Elizabeth knew that his act of compassion had only made their original difference in rank and family dignity more apparent. He had saved her family's honor, but he had likely sealed his own fate away from her, simply because no man of his standing, even having performed a heroic deed, could be expected to bear such a permanent, vulgar connection. She felt a wave of crushing humility wash over her. She could only wait now, in gratitude and self-reproach, hoping that the depth of his devotion was even greater than the depth of his disdain for the connections he had so painstakingly secured for her. Chapter 11. The very air around Elizabeth seemed to shimmer with a joy so profound it was almost tangible. She stood beside him, her hand nestled in the crook of his arm, sunlight turning the gold band on her finger to a beacon. The ancient stone of the Meryton Church, the proud faces of her family, the gentle murmur of departing guests, it all coalesced into a perfect, indelible memory. Fitzwilliam Darcy, her husband, looked down at her, his eyes, once so formidable, now burning with an unreserved devotion that made her heart sing. They were now husband and wife. But not only that, beside them stand her beloved sister Jane with Mr. Bingley. Her hope had not been vain. Oh, how often in the solitary watches of the night had she wondered if she had irrevocably lost him. But after hearing of Darcy's role in rescuing Lydia, a quiet, desperate hope had taken root in her heart. She had scarcely dared to nurture it, knowing the capriciousness of fate and the weight of her own pride and prejudice. But he had come back. He had sought her out again, humbled and earnest, and had proposed anew. Words that had dissolved all lingering doubt and brought forth a flood of joyous acceptance. Now, as the carriage pulled away from the church, bearing them towards London and their new life, an easy silence settled between them. Darcy, ever perceptive, sensed a quiet intensity in her. He reached for her hand and brought it to his lips, a tender gesture that spoke volumes. "Are you quite well, my dearest Elizabeth?" he murmured, a smile playing on his lips. She squeezed his hand. "Never better, Fitzwilliam, but there is something I yearn to tell you, something of the year that has passed since the first time you proposed." She paused, her gaze drifting out the window at the passing countryside of Hertfordshire, so familiar, so soon to be left behind. "I have learned that my prejudice, even my expectations, direct my feelings, decisions, and my interpretations of situations and people more than I had imagined. And that period after I read your letter was a profound one for me. It was as if a veil had been lifted, not merely from my eyes but from my spirit. I had to change my expectations. I had to reject my prejudice." Darcy listened, his attention absolute. He knew well the journey of introspection she spoke of, having traveled a similar, if parallel, path himself. "I saw then with horrifying clarity," she continued, "the magnitude of my prejudice, the foolishness of my pride. It was not merely that I had misjudged you, Fitzwilliam. It was that I had allowed my own vanity and preconceived notions to blind me to the truth, to kindness, to worth. My confidence in my own judgment, once my greatest boast, crumpled beneath the weight of my errors." She turned to him, her eyes bright with earnestness. "There were moments of despair, I will confess. Moments when I believed I had forfeited every chance of happiness. The thought that I might have lost you forever, through my own willful ignorance, became a heavy companion. I saw a future stretching before me, perhaps comfortable, but devoid of the unique fire I had felt in your presence, however much I had denied it." He tightened his grip on her hand, a silent promise of understanding. "But with that despair," Elizabeth went on, her voice growing stronger, "came a different understanding. I realized that to dwell in regret, to allow the fear of what might have been, or what might never be, to consume me, was to waste the present. I had been so busy guarding against perceived slights, so quick to assume the worst, that I had inadvertently invited unhappiness. I learned, Fitzwilliam, that while one must be aware of the perils of the world, one need not anticipate them with dread at every turn." Her gaze met his, open and resolute. "I found in that long year that my experiences, even the painful self-revelations, had tempered me. They had shown me the fragility of human judgment, but also the resilience of the human spirit. I discovered that I could expect more from life and from myself than simply avoiding disappointment. I learned to look for the good, to believe in the possibility of it, even when circumstances seemed bleak." A contemplative smile touched her lips. "I learned, Fitzwilliam, to expect always the best. Not foolishly, mind you. I am not ignorant of life's complexities, nor of the worst possibilities that lurk in every corner. I have seen enough of suffering, enough of folly to know that misfortune can strike the innocent and the deserving alike. But the fear of the worst, the trepidation of potential sorrow or hardship that I vowed should never again determine my feelings or dictate my actions. It should never again hold my heart captive. Darcy looked at her, a profound admiration softening the austere lines of his face. He had fallen in love with her wit, her intelligence, her spirited independence. But this deepened wisdom, this thoughtful strength made his love for her even more boundless. "My dearest Elizabeth," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are indeed an extraordinary woman. To have undergone such a period of profound reflection, to have emerged not only whole but enriched. It confirms every reason I have for loving you. We have both, perhaps, walked through the fire of our own making and come to understand that true happiness lies not in escaping difficulty, but in meeting it with courage and an open heart." He shifted closer, drawing her into the warmth of his embrace. "To expect the best whilst acknowledging the worst," he mused. "It is a philosophy born of both wisdom and hope, and I, for one, could wish for no finer partner to face whatever the future may hold with such a spirit." Elizabeth rested her head on his shoulder, a perfect tranquility settling over her. The carriage rolled on, bearing them away from the landscape of their past, towards London, towards Pemberley, towards the glorious uncertainty of a future she now knew to embrace, not with trepidation, but with an unwavering hope for the best.